A routine traffic stop takes a shocking turn when a racist cop points his gun at Big Shaq, unaware of the man's true identity. What unfolds next is a powerful story of resilience, unexpected twists, and a message that will leave you inspired. Prepare to witness a moment that changes everything, because some lessons are learned the hard way. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The hum of the truck's engine was the only sound on the quiet stretch of highway, the headlights carving a path through the inky darkness. Big Shaq sat behind the wheel, one hand resting on the steering wheel, the other tapping in rhythm to the smooth jazz playing softly on the radio. Dressed in a simple black hoodie and worn jeans, his relaxed posture betrayed none of the weariness he felt after a long day. The road was empty, save for the occasional set of headlights in the distance, and the familiar solitude of late-night driving gave Shaq a sense of calm. He glanced at the dashboard clock. 11:23 p.m. Home was less than 20 minutes away, and he was already picturing his warm bed. Then, out of nowhere, flashing red and blue lights pierced the darkness behind him. Shaq's brow furrowed as he checked his speedometer. He wasn't speeding. His registration was up to date. So why was he being pulled over? Letting out a measured sigh, he signaled and pulled to the side of the road, his truck rolling to a stop on the gravel shoulder. The cruiser stopped behind him, its lights bouncing off the trees lining the highway. Shaq turned off the radio and rolled down the window, keeping both hands visible on the steering wheel, an instinct honed by experience. The door of the cruiser opened, and a figure stepped out, his silhouette illuminated by the headlights. Deputy Darren Walker approached with deliberate steps, his hand resting conspicuously on the holster at his hip. Even in the dim light, Shaq could see the tightness in his jaw and the sharpness in his eyes. "License and registration," Walker barked, his tone curt and devoid of courtesy. Shaq remained calm, his deep voice steady as he replied, "Sure thing, officer. Let me grab them from the glove compartment." "Slowly," Walker snapped, his tone sharp. Shaq nodded and moved with deliberate care, retrieving the documents and handing them over. Walker snatched them without a word and retreated to his cruiser, leaving Shaq sitting in the truck, his patience wearing thin. Minutes passed, each one stretching longer than the last. Shaq could see the officer in his side mirror, pacing back and forth near the cruiser. Something felt off. When Walker returned, his demeanor was even more aggressive. "Step out of the vehicle," he ordered, his hand now gripping the holstered gun. "Is there a problem, officer?" Shaq asked, his voice calm but firm. "Don't question me," Walker snapped, his voice rising. "Step out of the vehicle now." Shaq exhaled slowly, unbuckling his seatbelt. He opened the door and stepped out, his large frame unfolding with ease. At 6 feet 7 inches, Shaq towered over the deputy, but his body language remained non-threatening, his hands raised slightly. "What's going on?" Shaq asked again, his tone measured. Walker's hand tightened on his weapon. "You match the description of a suspect we're looking for," he said, though his eyes betrayed doubt. Shaq's eyebrows furrowed. "What description?" "I'm just a guy driving home." Walker's expression hardened, and in one swift motion he drew his gun, aiming it directly at Shaq. "Don't move," Walker shouted, his voice shaking slightly. Shaq froze, his hand still raised. The cold barrel of the gun gleamed under the harsh glare of the cruiser's headlights, and for a moment, time seemed to stand still. "Officer," Shaq said evenly, his voice cutting through the tension. "I'm unarmed. I'm not a threat. There's no need for this." Walker didn't lower the weapon. His grip tightened, his finger hovering dangerously close to the trigger. Shaq could see the conflict in his eyes. Fear mingled with authority, a lethal combination. The sound of a car approaching broke the standoff, its headlights casting new shadows across the scene. Shaq glanced toward the passing vehicle, the weight of its passengers' stares evident even in their brief passing. "Officer," Shaq said again, his tone firm but not confrontational. "Whatever you think I've done, this isn't the way to handle it. Let's talk." Walker hesitated, the tension in his shoulders betraying his uncertainty. But the gun didn't lower. In that moment, Shaq thought of his mother's words, spoken years ago. "Stay calm, no matter what." Show them you're better than the hate they bring. He met Walker's gaze, his voice steady and resolute. You don't want to do this. Put the gun down. The tension was palpable, the night air heavy with unspoken words. Walker's breathing was shallow, his indecision clear. The headlights of another car appeared in the distance, its faint glow growing brighter as it approached. The moment hung in the balance, teetering between chaos and resolution. And for Shaq, the only choice was to hold firm, to stay calm, and to hope that the weight of the night wouldn't push the officer over the edge. The muzzle of the gun didn't waver, and neither did Shaq. He stood tall, his hands raised slightly in a gesture of submission, though his calm expression suggested anything but surrender. The cool night air pressed heavily around them, punctuated by the distant hum of crickets and the occasional passing car. Don't make me say it again, Deputy Walker barked, his voice sharper now, betraying the slightest tremor of uncertainty. Shaq met his gaze evenly. Officer, I'm not resisting. I'm just standing here. You've got the power right now. Use it wisely. The words were simple, but they carried weight, each one chosen with precision. Shaq's deep, even tone didn't rise in anger or panic. He knew better. He had to know better. A flicker of frustration crossed Walker's face. Power, he sneered, gripping the gun tighter. You think this is about power? Don't play games with me. Shaq inhaled slowly, keeping his breathing steady. His mind drifted, unbidden, to a moment from his past. He was 19, standing outside a convenience store with a soda in hand, when two officers approached him. The accusations had come fast and unrelenting: loitering, trespassing, shoplifting. None of it was true, but the humiliation burned just the same. His mother's words rang in his memory, as they always did in moments like these. Stay steady, Shaq. Don't let them see fear, and don't give them a reason. Now, years later, those words anchored him. He focused on keeping his voice calm, his body language neutral. Officer, Shaq said, his tone unshaken. I don't know what you think I've done, but I promise you, I'm not a threat. Walker's jaw tightened. He glanced at the passing cars, their taillights glowing faintly in the distance. A few drivers slowed, their curious eyes catching brief glimpses of the tense scene. Shaq could almost feel the weight of their judgment, the silent witnesses to a story they couldn't fully understand. You match the description of a suspect, Walker said, his voice louder now, as though convincing himself as much as anyone else. What description is that? Shaq asked evenly. Big guy in a hoodie driving a truck? Walker's face flushed, the red creeping up his neck like a warning light. Don't get smart with me, he snapped. Shaq shook his head slightly, a flicker of disappointment in his eyes. I'm not trying to get smart. I'm trying to get home. For a brief moment, the tension seemed to hang in the balance. Then Walker stepped closer, the barrel of the gun still trained on Shaq's chest. I'll decide when you get to go home, he said coldly. Shaq's muscles tensed, but he didn't move. He could feel the adrenaline coursing through his veins, but he wouldn't let it show. Not now, not here. Look, Shaq said, his voice softer but no less firm. There's a family driving by right now, kids in the back seat. They're watching this. You really want them to remember you this way? Walker faltered, the flicker of doubt returning to his eyes. But his pride wouldn't let him back down. He gestured sharply with the gun. On the ground, now. Shaq hesitated, his jaw tightening. The gravel crunched under his boots as he slowly lowered himself to his knees, his movements deliberate. All right, he said quietly. But know this, officer. Everything you're doing right now, it's on you. The words cut through the air like a knife, and for the first time, Walker looked uncertain. His breathing quickened, his grip on the gun trembling slightly. Behind the scenes of this escalating moment, Shaq's mind was calculating, measuring each action and reaction. He didn't just see Walker's hostility. He saw the fear beneath it, fear of losing control, fear of being wrong. Another car slowed as it passed, the driver visibly rolling down a window to get a better look. Walker turned his head briefly, the weight of the spectators pressing on him. You think you're some kind of hero, don't you? Walker hissed, his words aimed as much at himself as at Shaq. Shaq looked up from the gravel, his dark eyes steady and unwavering. No, he said simply. I think I'm a man who deserves to be treated like one." The words hung in the air, heavy with truth. Walker opened his mouth to respond but stopped, his expression flickering between defiance and doubt. The sound of another car pulling over broke the standoff. A new figure emerged from the shadows, a senior officer, his face creased with age and authority. He took in the scene with a sharp glance, his presence commanding immediate attention. "What's going on here, Deputy Walker?" the senior officer demanded, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. For the first time that night, Walker looked uncertain. He lowered the gun slightly, the weight of his actions beginning to settle on his shoulders. And Shaq, still kneeling in the gravel, let out a slow breath. He wasn't free yet, but the tide was beginning to turn. The quiet, rural roadside was beginning to transform. The faint sound of a car slowing down turned into the hum of an engine idling as a family pulled over, their sedan coming to a stop a safe distance from the confrontation. From inside the vehicle, whispers of concern grew louder as a woman leaned forward, her phone in hand. "Is he pointing a gun at that man?" she murmured, angling her phone to record. "Shh," her husband cautioned, but his eyes didn't leave the tense scene. Their two young children, seated in the back, peered out of the window, wide-eyed and silent. As the family watched, another car approached, this time pulling off the road and parking nearby. A young black man in his mid-20s stepped out, dressed in business casual attire. Tyler Jenkins was on his way home from a study group, his backpack slung over one shoulder. But the sight of a police officer with a gun drawn on an unarmed man stopped him cold. Tyler took a moment to assess the situation, his instincts as a third-year law student kicking in. He didn't recognize the man at first, but saw the tension in Shaq's body, the calculated calm in his demeanor as he knelt on the gravel. He also noticed the officer, his flushed face, the trembling hand clutching the gun, the glances toward the growing audience. "Hey," Tyler called, his voice firm but not aggressive as he approached cautiously. "What's going on here?" Deputy Walker's head snapped toward Tyler, his already frayed composure thinning further. "Stay back," he barked, pointing a finger at him. "This doesn't concern you." Tyler stopped a few feet away, raising his hands to show he meant no harm. "Actually, it does," he said evenly. "I'm a law student, and what I'm seeing here doesn't look right. Why is your weapon drawn on an unarmed man?" The question hung in the air, the tension thick enough to cut. "Listen, kid, I don't need a lecture from you," Walker snapped, his voice rising. "Get back in your car and drive away." But Tyler stood his ground, his voice calm but insistent. "Officer, he's not resisting. You're escalating this, and there are witnesses recording everything. This isn't how it's supposed to go." Shaq, still kneeling, turned his head slightly, his eyes catching Tyler's for a brief moment. A flicker of gratitude passed between them, though neither spoke. Meanwhile, the family in the sedan continued recording, their whispered commentary growing more worried. "This could get out of hand," the father muttered. The mother, her phone trained steadily on the scene, responded quietly. "Good. Maybe someone will see this and do something." Other cars began to slow as they passed, their occupants craning their necks to catch a glimpse of what was happening. A couple of vehicles pulled over, adding to the growing crowd. People stepped out cautiously, their faces a mix of concern and curiosity. Walker's eyes darted around, the pressure mounting as he realized he was no longer in control of the narrative. The murmurs of the onlookers reached his ears, their judgment palpable. "Why is he pointing a gun at that guy? He's not even doing anything. This is crazy." The officer's hand trembled slightly, and he barked at the crowd. "Everyone back off. This is a police matter." But his words had the opposite effect. The presence of witnesses emboldened the onlookers, their gazes unrelenting. Tyler took another step forward, his tone growing sharper. "Officer, you're out of line. You're holding an unarmed man at gunpoint in front of families, kids. How does this make sense?" Walker's face darkened, the combination of scrutiny and authority being questioned driving him further into a corner. "I said back off," he shouted, his voice cracking. Shaq, sensing the situation spiraling, spoke for the first time since Tyler arrived. His voice was calm but commanding. "Everyone, stay where you are. Don't give him a reason." The crowd fell silent, the authority in Shaq's tone momentarily cutting through the chaos. He turned his attention to Walker, his words measured and deliberate. "Deputy, you're losing control. Put the gun down before this becomes something it doesn't have to be." Walker's breathing quickened, his grip on the weapon tightening. But the growing number of witnesses was working against him. The camera phones, the murmurs, the questions, they were all adding weight to the moment. Tyler stepped in again, his voice now filled with conviction. "Do the right thing, officer. Lower the weapon. No one here wants this to end badly. Least of all you." Walker hesitated, the pressure visibly cracking his resolve. The murmurs grew louder, and the faint sound of sirens in the distance added to the tension. Shaq remained still, his hands steady and raised. "It's over," he said softly, his eyes locked on Walker's. "Let it go." The sirens grew louder, and for a moment, time seemed to freeze. Then, with a shaky exhale, Walker finally lowered the gun. The crowd let out a collective breath, the tension breaking like a dam. Phones continued recording, capturing every second of the aftermath. Tyler approached Shaq cautiously, extending a hand to help him up. "You good?" Tyler asked quietly. Shaq nodded, his gratitude clear. "Yeah. Thanks for stepping in." But as the sirens reached them and the red and blue lights bathed the scene, Shaq knew this was just the beginning of the night's story. The cool night air felt heavy with tension, the kind that clung to skin and made every breath seem louder. Shaq knelt on the gravel, his broad shoulders squared, exuding a quiet strength despite the gun aimed at him. His hands remained steady, palms visible, as if to reassure everyone present, especially the officer of his composure. "Deputy," Shaq said, his deep voice calm but firm, carrying over the murmurs of the growing crowd. "I'm not resisting. I'm not a threat. Let's talk this out." Deputy Darren Walker's jaw tightened, his grip on the weapon still unnervingly taut. He shifted his stance, his gaze flickering between Shaq and the onlookers, who were becoming more vocal. His authority, once absolute, was slipping through his fingers, and it showed. "You don't get to talk your way out of this," Walker snapped, his voice trembling despite his attempt at dominance. "You're not in charge here." Shaq tilted his head slightly, his gaze unwavering. "I'm not trying to take charge," he replied evenly. "I'm trying to keep this from going somewhere we both don't want it to go." The crowd stirred, their whispers growing louder. "He's so calm," one woman remarked. "Why is the cop acting like this?" Shaq's mind, though focused on the present, couldn't help but wander for a fleeting moment. His late mother's voice echoed in his thoughts, a memory sharp and clear. "Shaquille," she used to say, her voice soft but filled with conviction. "You're going to face hate in this world. Don't let it drag you down. Rise above it. Show them your strength, not your anger." The memory gave him strength now. He wasn't just standing up for himself. He was standing up for something much larger. Shaq met Walker's eyes again, his expression calm but resolute. "Deputy, I've done nothing wrong. You pulled me over for a broken taillight. At least that's what you said. But now you're pointing a gun at me. I need you to think about that." Walker faltered, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. "I know what I'm doing," he barked, though the words felt hollow. "Do you?" Shaq asked, his tone laced with quiet authority. "Because everyone here is watching. They're recording. They're going to remember this moment, just like I will. So what do you want them to see?" The murmurs grew into a low rumble as more people voiced their concerns. "This is crazy," someone shouted. "He's not even doing anything." Walker's eyes darted to the crowd, his confidence visibly cracking. The weight of the public gaze pressed down on him, and his earlier bravado began to crumble. Tyler, the young law student, stepped forward again, his voice steady but forceful. "Officer, listen to him. He's right. You're escalating a situation that doesn't need escalation. Lower the weapon." Shaq gave a small nod of appreciation toward Tyler, but kept his attention locked on Walker. "I'm not here to fight you," Shaq said, his voice softer now, but no less commanding. "I just want to go home. And I think deep down, you want to go home too." For a moment the two men stood, or rather knelt and stood, locked in a silent battle of wills. But the longer Walker hesitated, the clearer it became that Shaq was the immovable force in this scenario, not him. The officer's hand wavered, the muzzle of the gun dipping slightly. His gaze flicked to the crowd again, their phones held high, recording every second. "You don't understand," Walker muttered, his voice quieter now, almost to himself. "Then help me understand," Shaq urged, his tone filled with genuine sincerity. "But you've got to start by putting that gun down." The crowd's energy shifted, the tension beginning to give way to a collective sense of hope. A few people murmured words of encouragement to Shaq, their voices carrying over the quiet hum of passing cars. "You can end this right now," Shaq continued, his eyes steady on Walker's. "And it doesn't have to end badly. Not for you, not for me, not for anyone." The officer's chest rose and fell rapidly, his breathing loud in the charged silence. The weight of his decisions, of the moment, pressed heavily on him. Slowly, almost reluctantly, Walker began to lower the gun. His hand trembled as he did, the weapon pointing toward the ground before he finally returned it to its holster. A collective sigh of relief rippled through the crowd. Some clapped quietly, others simply stood in stunned silence. Shaq exhaled, his shoulders relaxing as he rose to his full height. He towered over Walker, but his presence was anything but menacing. Instead, it was calm, steady, a pillar of strength in the midst of chaos. "Thank you," Shaq said quietly. Walker didn't respond. His face was pale, his eyes darting nervously as if he couldn't quite comprehend what had just happened. Shaq turned to the crowd, offering a small nod of reassurance. "We're good now," he said, his voice calm but carrying the weight of authority. "Everyone, thank you for staying here." The scene, though de-escalated, left an indelible mark on everyone present. Shaq's calm resolve had not only diffused a dangerous situation, but had also exposed the cracks in a system that allowed such moments to occur in the first place. As the sirens of backup officers grew louder in the distance, Shaq prepared himself for what would come next. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about a much larger fight for dignity and justice. The low hum of approaching sirens cut through the tense air as the growing crowd murmured among themselves, phones still raised to capture every second of the unfolding scene. Shaq stood tall, his calm presence an anchor amidst the chaos, while Deputy Walker paced nervously, his confidence visibly eroding. Shaq remained rooted, his hands relaxed at his sides, his deep voice steady as he continued to address the crowd. "It's all right, everyone. Let's stay calm and let this play out." The crowd parted slightly as a sleek black SUV pulled to the curb, its flashing lights reflecting off the surrounding cars. From it emerged Captain Howard Daniels, a seasoned officer in his late 50s, with a sharp uniform and an air of authority that immediately commanded attention. His gray-streaked hair and weathered face spoke of years in law enforcement, but his piercing blue eyes still carried a sharpness that made even the boldest men hesitate. "What's going on here?" Captain Daniels barked, his voice cutting through the murmurs. Deputy Walker straightened abruptly, snapping to attention. "Sir, just handling a potential threat," he said, his voice forced and rushed. Daniels' sharp gaze swept over the scene before settling on Shaq. Recognition sparked in his eyes, his stern expression softening as he stepped closer. "Wait a minute," Daniels said, his tone shifting from commanding to inquisitive. He gestured toward Shaq, his brow furrowing. "Aren't you Shaquille Carter?" The crowd stilled, the murmuring fading to silence as all eyes turned to Shaq. He nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "Yes, sir," he replied, his deep voice calm but measured. Daniels took another step forward, lowering his voice slightly. "You're the one who's been running those community outreach programs in the East End, right? Working with at-risk youth?" Shaq nodded again, his gaze steady. "That's me." The revelation rippled through the crowd like an electric current. Whispers broke out as people pieced together the realization. "I knew he looked familiar," someone exclaimed. "That's Big Shaq, the guy who built that rec center last year." Walker's face paled as the weight of the moment hit him. His earlier bravado crumbled, replaced by a dawning panic. I didn't realize," he stammered, his hands fidgeting as he tried to find an explanation. "I mean, he wasn't cooperating at first and—" "Enough," Daniels snapped, his sharp tone silencing Walker. He turned to Shaq, his expression apologetic. "Mr. Carter, I'm sorry about this. I assure you, this is not how we conduct ourselves." Shaq raised a hand, his calm demeanor never wavering. "Captain, I appreciate that, but this isn't about me. It's about how situations like this happen in the first place." The crowd murmured in agreement, their voices gaining strength as they called out to Daniels. "He's right. This could have gone so wrong." Daniels looked around, the weight of the moment settling heavily on his shoulders. He turned back to Walker, his expression a mix of disappointment and frustration. "Deputy Walker, holster your weapon and step back. Now." Walker hesitated, his face reddening as he fumbled to comply. His earlier aggression had evaporated, replaced by a nervous energy that made him look smaller, less imposing. As Walker stepped back, Daniels gestured for Shaq to join him away from the crowd. "Can we speak privately for a moment?" Shaq nodded, following Daniels a few steps away. The captain's voice softened, his tone one of genuine regret. "I've heard about the work you've done, Mr. Carter. The mentorship programs, the scholarship fund. You've done more for this community than most people ever will. This shouldn't have happened." Shaq studied Daniels for a moment before speaking, his voice steady, but carrying an edge of determination. "Captain, I appreciate the words, but what's important is what happens next. Not just for me, but for anyone else who might find themselves in this situation. Words aren't enough." Daniels nodded, his jaw tightening. "You're right," he admitted. "I'll make sure this is addressed properly, and I hope you'll hold me to that." Shaq's lips quirked into a faint smile, though his eyes remained serious. "I will." The conversation ended with a handshake that felt more like a silent agreement. As they returned to the crowd, Daniels addressed the onlookers, his voice firm. "Thank you all for staying calm. This situation has been resolved, and I assure you, steps will be taken to ensure accountability." The crowd began to disperse slowly, though their phones remained raised, capturing every word and movement. Shaq turned back to Tyler, the young law student, offering him a nod of gratitude. "Thanks for stepping up back there," Shaq said. Tyler shrugged, a small smile tugging at his lips. "You didn't need me. You handled it like a pro." As Shaq climbed back into his truck, the tension in the air finally began to dissipate. But for everyone who had witnessed the night's events, the moment would linger, a stark reminder of the work still left to be done. For Walker, however, the night had taken an entirely different turn. His actions would be scrutinized, and the consequences of his choices would follow him long after the crowd had gone. The flashing red and blue lights from the senior officer's vehicle illuminated the tense scene as Captain Daniels addressed Deputy Walker. His voice was sharp, cutting through the murmur of the gathered crowd. "Deputy Walker, holster your weapon, now." Daniels' tone left no room for argument. Walker hesitated for a split second, his hand trembling as it gripped the handle of his gun. The weight of the crowd's judgment, the camera phones aimed directly at him, and the stern gaze of his superior seemed to finally register. Slowly, he lowered the gun, his face a mixture of embarrassment and confusion as he holstered it. Daniels stepped closer, his expression unreadable but his voice stern. "Care to explain what warranted this level of escalation?" Walker stammered, his confidence visibly crumbling. "Sir, I believed he was a threat. He wasn't complying right away, and—" "Enough." Daniels cut him off with a raised hand. He turned to Shaq, whose calm yet firm demeanor had not faltered despite the tension. "Mr. Carter," Daniels said, his tone shifting to one of respect. "Please, tell me exactly what happened here." Shaq nodded, his deep voice carrying an authority of its own. "I was driving home following all the rules. Deputy Walker pulled me over, said it was for a traffic violation, though I didn't commit one. I kept my hands visible, did everything by the book, but he escalated, raised his voice, drew his weapon. I didn't provoke or resist." Daniels glanced toward the crowd, his jaw tightening as he saw the mixture of concerned, angry, and horrified faces watching intently. "Is that accurate, Deputy?" he asked Walker, though it was more a formality than a genuine question. Walker's lips pressed into a thin line. I believed I was following protocol, sir." "Protocol doesn't involve pointing a gun at an unarmed man who hasn't posed a threat," Daniels snapped, his voice rising. Meanwhile, the crowd grew more animated. The young law student, Tyler, stepped forward, his phone still recording. "This isn't just about tonight," Tyler said, his voice steady but tinged with frustration. It's about how often things like this happen. What if this hadn't been recorded? What if Mr. Carter wasn't who he is? Daniel sighed heavily, the weight of the moment settling on his shoulders. You're right, he admitted, his voice quieter. And that's a problem I can't ignore. Shaq took a step forward, his towering presence drawing the attention of everyone around him. Captain, he said, his voice calm but resolute. I'm not interested in vengeance or making an example out of anyone. But accountability matters. People need to see that actions like this have consequences. Daniels met Shaq's gaze and nodded. They will, he said firmly. Turning to Walker, he gestured toward the patrol car. Deputy Walker, I'm placing you on immediate suspension pending an internal investigation. Hand over your badge and firearm. Walker's face flushed crimson as gasps rippled through the crowd. Slowly, reluctantly, he unhooked his badge and placed it in Daniels's outstretched hand. The weight of the moment was palpable. As Walker was escorted to the car, the murmurs of the crowd began to shift. Conversations sparked, voices rising as people shared their anger, their relief, and their own stories of injustice. Shaq turned back to the crowd, his deep voice cutting through the noise. This isn't about me, he said. It's about making sure no one else has to go through this. Change starts with all of us, by speaking up, holding people accountable, and refusing to stay silent. The crowd erupted in applause, their collective energy a mix of anger and hope. Tyler stepped forward again, extending his hand to Shaq. Thank you for staying calm, for standing your ground. You've set an example tonight. Shaq shook his hand, offering a small, weary smile. It's going to take more than me. Keep speaking out, Tyler. By the time the scene cleared, videos of the encounter had already begun circulating online. Clips of Walker's aggressive behavior juxtaposed with Shaq's calm resolve ignited a firestorm of reactions. Comments flooded in, ranging from outrage at the injustice to admiration for Shaq's grace under pressure. News outlets picked up the story, and hashtags demanding justice trended on social media. The incident became a rallying cry for those pushing for reform, sparking discussions about systemic bias and the need for better training and accountability within law enforcement. As Shaq drove home that night, the adrenaline began to fade, replaced by a quiet resolve. He knew the fight for change was far from over, but tonight, a step had been taken. And sometimes, a single step was all it took to start a movement. The warm afternoon sun bathed the community park in golden light as Big Shaq stood among a group of wide-eyed kids, his towering presence both commanding and comforting. His deep voice carried over the chatter of the children as he spoke, holding their attention with a mix of humor, wisdom, and humility. Remember, he said, crouching to meet their curious gazes. Being strong isn't about how loud you are or how many people you can scare. Real strength? It's about knowing when to stay calm, when to stand up for what's right, and when to use your voice to help, not hurt. The kids nodded, their expressions a mix of admiration and determination. A young boy raised his hand, his small voice cutting through the group's quiet. Mr. Shaq, were you scared when that officer pulled his gun on you? Shaq paused, his eyes softening. Yeah, I was scared, he admitted, his voice steady. But fear doesn't have to control you. It can teach you something. That night I remembered what my mom used to tell me. Always rise above hate, because the world needs more builders, not destroyers. So, that's what I tried to do. As he spoke, a few parents standing nearby exchanged glances, their faces a mixture of gratitude and admiration. The incident with the deputy had sparked a national conversation. But for Shaq, the real victory was moments like these, teaching the next generation to lead with kindness and courage. Earlier that week, Shaq had given an interview to a local news station that had quickly gone viral. In it, he recounted the tense encounter with Deputy Walker, his tone even and reflective. What happened to me wasn't unique, he had said, his voice firm but free of bitterness. A lot of people face these situations every day, and they don't always end the way mine did. That's why we need change, not just in policies, but in how we treat each other. Hate doesn't fix hate. Only understanding can do that. His words resonated across the community and beyond. Calls for reform gained traction, with activists and citizens demanding better training and accountability for law enforcement. The local police department announced an internal investigation into Deputy Walker's actions, pledging to review its procedures and policies. Shaq's calm and composed handling of the situation became a beacon of hope for many. People of all backgrounds shared their own stories of discrimination and resilience, inspired by his message of grace under pressure. Meanwhile, Deputy Walker's fate remained uncertain. Placed on administrative leave, he faced a thorough inquiry that would determine his future in the force. Public opinion was divided. Some called for his dismissal, while others hoped the incident would lead to his own growth and understanding. For Shaq, the focus wasn't on punishment, but on progress. "We can't just stop at pointing fingers," he said during his interview. "We have to ask ourselves, how do we make sure this doesn't happen again? How do we build a system that sees everyone as equal?" Back at the park, Shaq stood as the kids dispersed, running toward the basketball court where a community game was starting. A young girl paused, looking up at him with a shy smile. "Thanks for talking to us, Mr. Shaq," she said. He smiled warmly, resting a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Anytime, kiddo. You just remember, you've got a voice, and it matters. Use it to make the world better, all right?" She nodded and ran off, her laughter mingling with the sound of bouncing basketballs and cheering kids. As Shaq watched her go, a sense of quiet fulfillment settled over him. He knew the road ahead was long, but moments like these reminded him why it was worth traveling. Change wasn't just about headlines or viral videos. It was about planting seeds of hope and understanding in the hearts of people who would carry them forward. Above all, Shaq believed in the power of unity, in the strength that came from standing together against injustice. And as he looked out at the vibrant scene in the park, he felt a deep sense of gratitude for the opportunity to lead by example. The camera panned away as Shaq picked up a basketball, joining the kids for a game. His laughter echoed through the park, a reminder that even in the face of adversity, hope and resilience could light the way forward. If this story moved you, let it inspire action. Share it with your friends and family to spark conversations about standing up to prejudice and fostering understanding. Together, we can work toward a world where dignity and respect prevail. Leave a comment below with your thoughts. How can we all play a role in creating change? Let's start the dialogue today.